Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Pikel with League of Items, and I am joined once again by BVE, the eGOAT originator, Billy Von Elders. Billy, how's it going?
It's going well. How's it going with you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. I released a shorter video today, so I'm sure a lot of people are surprised that I only released like a 12-minute video. So now I'm coming at him with the long one. That's a weird thing to say, but but we have Billy here, and we're gonna go over the eGOAT rankings. We're gonna kind of start off with the ESPN Power rankings as just a jumping off point. Um, so before we get into the actual rankings, do you want to explain to everybody what you've developed with eGOAT?
Sure. So this is, I guess this started out in the spring when I first started playing a bit more LOL DFS, and I was sort of just playing around with gold numbers in my database. It's sort of just something I pull with sort of kills, deaths, the other stuff that goes more directly into or goes directly into DFS scoring. And the reason I focused on gold just sort of as a new to LOL was it seemed like something that sort of goes both top up and bottom, or it goes sort of top down and bottom up, right? So when you get it, earning gold is evidence of doing good things, knocking down a tower, getting kills, getting assists, whatever. It also then helps you perform in the future because
Yeah.
getting more gold gets you more items, and sort of it's sort of the root of the snowball
Yeah.
in some sense. And so I just started tracking it and sort of sort of looking at gold differential between teams as a sort of there's so little information in just win-loss records in LOL that I was trying to look for a way to sort of more accurately differentiate teams. And so from there, I started looking, it was like, well, gold is different because teams play different length games. So then I went down to gold per minute.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started looking at gold differential, sort of adjusting that for strength of schedule because, with different look back periods, you might be playing all bad teams, all good teams, whatever. So this is something I've been tracking since the spring, and it did a sort of relatively good job of predicting winners, at least I thought anecdotally. So between spring and summer, I spent a little time refining this. And so what eGOAT is, eGOAT stands for expected gold over average team. It's a league by league metric that is scaled to essentially say in a average length game, which in I think the games I've tracked is about 33 minutes.
Okay.
What would be the end of game goal differential between this team and an average team in that league? So if you look at the most recent rankings I posted on Thursday of last week, Cloud9 is at like 6,000 or 7,000 gold, I think, which means that would be the expected differential based on these numbers between Cloud9 and an average LCS team. Which, when you think about a team in a 33-minute game earning about somewhere maybe 50,000-ish gold, it's a pretty significant difference, right? But to be at 53 versus 47 or 56 versus 50.
Sure.
So that's the basic idea behind this.
Okay. So so before we started the video, Billy was saying that he's about 70% with like predicting the winners of matchups. For people who have been following my picks, my total right now, I'm at about 64%. And I think one thing that's probably different between the bets that I'm making and the bets that the picks that the eGOAT ranking is making is that mine, I'm looking for underdogs probably a little more often, and then I'm also taking like the value of the bet into consideration as opposed to having like an agnostic pick in regards to money. So like if I didn't have to risk $1,500 on like a gigantic favorite like what we have tonight, then it'd be much easier to make that pick and make that bet in real life. So I think originally let's just get started with Dignitas. So in your eGOAT rankings, how does it respond to a team like Dignitas?
How does it respond in what respect? To the roster changes or
Well,
to
so the eGOAT, like, are they the lowest ranked team in the LCS for eGOAT?
They are right now, yes. They are at minus. I think this is not including. So I have in my numbers. this including last weekend's game, but have not posted those. So I'm not sure if anyone, or I guess no one else has them. So I'm just looking at the difference ones. So yeah, going into last weekend, Dignitas was at about negative 3,600, and in last, by a pretty wide margin. They were basically double, sort of twice as far away from league average as Immortals, which was the ninth place team.
Okay.
After last weekend, they've made up some ground. They're still last, but the margin between them and the new ninth place team is CLG. It's much narrower. It's only about 600 gold, which is
interesting.
I think sort of negligible.
Yeah. So okay. So just to speak to that real quick, the roster changes that have happened recently with Dignitas and Immortals, I think it makes sense that Immortals is climbing in your rankings, and then also with CLG, they had a very weak early of the season schedule, and they've been playing some better teams. They've been losing, so that is the kind of thing that I guess the ranking system, it does kind of take into consideration, but it might not be able to anticipate how the teams are going to shift as easy as like the eye test. I think,
yeah.
Or at least like having secondary knowledge of these players. So let's just go up these rankings until we find the next LCS team. Next up, we have 100 Thieves. So we have 100 Thieves, Immortals, and Golden Guardians all clustered in the rankings. Are they pretty close in yours as well?
They are. With the what were the three there? 100 Thieves, Golden Guardians, and
Immortals. Yeah.
CLG.
Immortals.
Yes. So Golden Guardians, I would have, I guess, is maybe a tier above them. Those other three in my rankings. Okay. As is 100 Thieves. 100 Thieves had a pretty solid jump. Or that might even not be the best way to put it. I think in the eGOAT rankings, LCS became sort of stratified this week. So I think going into last weekend, it was sort of C9 in its own tier, FlyQuest and TSM in the tier below them, then Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses, and Golden Guardians in the third tier, fourth tier CLG, 100 Thieves, Immortals, and then Dignitas at the bottom. Coming out of last weekend, I still have C9 up top, FlyQuest and TSM still in that second tier. The new third tier is 100 Thieves, Evil Geniuses, Golden Guardians, and Team Liquid. And then Immortals, CLG, and Dignitas are in sort of a fourth tier at the bottom.
Immortals, CLG, Dig are the bottom tier. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's a spot where 100 Thieves is probably getting too much credit for beating Dignitas, right? I know that a few of their recent matches have been a little bit closer, and since they made the roster change, they did pick up a victory, and I think one of their losses was a lot closer. But that is interesting. I'm not so let me get those again. You said, let me just see if I got it right. So you have C9 in the first tier, then you have FlyQuest and TSM in the second tier, Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses,
100 Thieves, and Golden Guardians.
And is that in order as well?
The order there would be, they're just a tier, but the order would be 100 Thieves first in that tier, then Evil Geniuses, and then surprisingly to me, Golden Guardians third, and then Team Liquid fourth.
That is interesting. Okay. Sure. And I think
Team Liquid was the big. I would expect them to be maybe even at the top of that tier.
Yeah.
Just sort of if I was guessing.
Yeah. So one thing that I should mention is that when we were discussing this on Twitter or YouTube, or I think it was Twitter, somebody kind of asked like, shouldn't you be adjusting things more aggressively because like there are a lot of potential oversights? Like, are you doing things to kind of adjust rankings before you release it? And I think we both were on the same page where it should be kind of agnostic to what's actually going on, because we're trying to look at a statistic that might give us some kind of insight into future performance that the human eye is going to miss. So if we're sitting there and watching every single game, which a lot of people do, you might get biased by just watching. Like if you're not taking those other things into consideration, you might miss out on something. So that's what we're trying to pick up on here, right?
Yeah, and I think that's sort of, in my mind, it's something that frustrates me about in sports in general, the analytics versus sort of old school debate is 95% of the time, the two things are on the same page.
Yeah.
Like the eye test and the numbers say that C9 is way better than every other team in the LCS.
Yeah.
And it's these little spaces where they come out different that aren't a signal that either one is wrong, but that's what sparks the conversation. And that, which one is our eye test right, and are the numbers behind, or are the numbers ahead of our eyes?
Yeah.
And that's sort of where it gets interesting.
Yeah. So just so I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. The guy who made that comment, I'm pretty sure was Waco Kid, and that's also B. Connor from Twitch. So he is very analytical. It's not like he's a statistics denier or anything like that. He was just kind of taking it that next step as like a statistician and somebody who analyzes things, because he was trying to anticipate what he would do next in that scenario if he was trying to make something predictive for himself. So it's not like he was pushing back against it because it's like, oh, statistics. It's like the opposite of that. He's like, oh, awesome, this is so cool. Let's take it even a step further. So I just want to make that kind of clear for everybody watching. And because if he watches this, he might be a little upset. But he's not upset anymore because I clarified everything. So let me go back to the rankings for ESPN. So we have Dignitas in last place. Then we have 100 Thieves, Immortals, and Golden Guardians. We keep moving up. There seems to be a gigantic gap here. Then we have CLG, Evil Geniuses, TSM. I might be missing a team here. FlyQuest they have above them. Team Liquid they have even higher than that. So I think this is kind of speaking to your surprise for how the rankings kind of came out. And then C9 right now is ranked the 6th team in the world, which personally I think it's a little high. I understand why they do it. I understand like the rationale behind it. Have you tried doing the cross-league stuff yet? I know you said you were going to try it out.
Yeah, I was tinkering with it, and I haven't came back to it since we discussed it on Twitter 2 nights ago or whatever. Yeah. But the approach I'm taking there, so as I mentioned at the jump here, the current eGOAT rankings are on a league-by-league basis, so that there's no, the difference between, the C9 currently has the highest gap. It's not mean that the numbers are saying C9 is the best team in the world. It's just talking about them on an LCS isolated basis. Yeah. So I'm trying to come up with a way to compare these across leagues. And the first thing I'm taking a shot at is I'm looking at, I pulled a pool of players, sort of world championship caliber players that have played in multiple leagues. And I sort of take their and so I look at like Huhi. Take a look at the last season he played in the LCK, and then I think he may have played in the LEC the next year.
Yeah, Huni.
Sorry, Huni. And then just take the aggregate KDA. It was the only information I could find. I'd probably rather use a different number, but that was there.
Sure.
Of all of these players, and then look at the sort of difference in the KDA of all these aggregated players across the leagues. And it actually worked out. I don't know if it's directionally. It feels directionally accurate. So it gave the LCK.
Well, so wait, before you say it, let me just say how I would kind of look at it. So
okay, yeah.
So if I had a player that won a world championship moving to a weaker league, I would assume that the team that he's going to instantly becomes one of the better teams in that region. That's not necessarily the case. I think we've seen like when the mid laner from the Korean champion came over to the LCS, he played horribly and like they were bad.
So I'm sorry, what was the name there?
I forget what the name was. He played on Dignitas, I think. He went from like the world champion to the LCS and then just like
Someday?
Lost. No, that's no. He didn't win a world championship, but he is a world caliber, a world class player.
I'm just looking at the players I have included here. He was 2016 on KT and then 2017 on Dignitas. Our 2 seasons in the sample here.
Yeah, so the one that I'm thinking of would have been from 2018 to 2019. So the 2018 world champion. I don't really care that. I don't really care enough to. Like,
I was just curious. Yeah.
Yeah. So So yeah, that is interesting. I would say when we're looking at that, it does make a big difference for like who the player is, why they're going to the new league, what was that team standing before they came in, and what was their standing after they kind of arrived, because some of these players are difference makers and other ones aren't difference makers. I think when we take a look, I think it was Crown actually. I think that was his name. So for someone like Crown, he was technically a world champion, but he was not the key player on the team that won the championship, and his playstyle really didn't mesh with the team, and he just wasn't a very good mechanical player. He was more of like a shot calling kind of player. But that's like taking a very good point guard, a pass first point guard, and putting him onto a bad team. It's like, okay, well, he's passing the ball really well, but the guy still can't shoot, so it kind of just nothing happens. So just going back to the ESPN rankings versus the tier list that you gave me, we have Cloud9 in first. Team Liquid is the second ranked team in ESPN. They're in your third tier, so that's a bit of a difference, and we kind of already spoke to that. FlyQuest is accurately in the second tier. TSM's in the second tier. Evil Geniuses is fifth according to ESPN. They're in the third tier for the eGOAT rankings. CLG, there seems to be a big difference there as well. Golden Guardians, I guess your system has them a little bit higher, so that's another interesting thing to take a look at moving forward. Same thing with 100 Thieves, but otherwise it's all I guess, like you said, it's directionally accurate.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay, so let's take a look at the next league that we can get into. I think we should do the LEC. So I've been getting a lot of like, not a lot. I've been getting some people commenting on my video saying, "Hey man, what's up with the European hate?" And it's like, I don't hate Europe. I just like Europe less than you do. It's like, their argument is basically, well, a team from Europe beat a team from Korea or China. So why is Europe not just as good as them? It's like, well, we're talking about like the depth of the talent in those regions. That's what makes a region better. Sometimes it can be like, oh, well, Europe may not be the best, but they can create some kind of very good team that can compete on the world stage. I'm not denying that. I think when you have G2 playing up against a team from the LCK or LPL, it is much closer than if you took a random team from Europe versus a random team from Korea. That's all I'm trying to say. So
yeah, and maybe just to finish that or to tie that thought to the previous conversation. So where these initial numbers on the cross league comparison came out was if you look just at the KDA of the players in the four. So I have it looked at the LCK, LPL, LCS, and LEC here. Mm-hmm. If you just look at the KDA, then the LCK and LPL are basically on equal footing. The average KDA of the players was 3.93 in the LCK and 3.91 in the LPL, versus 3.62 in the LCS and 3.6 in the LEC. But if you add a win percentage element, sort of adjust it based on the win percentage of the team, sort of expecting players to have more kills and assists in wins.
Yeah.
You end up with the LCK ranked first, the LPL 2% lower than them, the LEC in third 5% lower than the LCK, and the LCS in fourth at 90% of the sort of top.
Interesting. All right, well, let's get into the European teams. So let's do your tier list first. So who do you have in the tier list?
I have, and so the craziness of last weekend didn't change the order of my rankings all that much, but basically just squeezed everything together.
Sure.
I think my read of my numbers is that I think there's maybe a gap between G2 and the rest of the league. Certainly not anywhere near where sort of C9 is compared to the rest of the LCS. And then Schalke, I think, is sort of by itself in sort of the bottom tier. But beyond that, I feel, especially maybe Fnatic can step back up if they start playing a little bit better. They're sort of the way they were at the end of the spring. But the way they've been playing in the summer split, it feels sort of like any of the other 8 teams on any given day in the LEC could beat each other.
Yeah.
So coming out of last weekend, I have G2 at 2,500, Fnatic still in second at 800,
Okay.
And then the difference between them and Vitality, which is in ninth place, is only about 2,000 gold. Sort of for comparison's sake, that's the difference between the second place team in the LCS and the fifth place team.
Sure.
So the
Yeah.
gap between second and fifth is the same as the second and ninth in the LEC.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty accurate because what I would expect is that the eGOAT is more in line with the wins and losses from the season. So right now we've seen a lot of parity in LEC. We haven't seen that same parity in the NALCS. We have seen some upsets, but not nearly as many upsets as the LEC. So anything that depends on goal differentials or wins and losses, which those two things are roughly correlated, you're going to get kind of this gigantic clump. So the interesting thing for that is that in a league where there's a tremendous amount of parity that has already occurred, this is going to kind of dovetail into something else. From a betting perspective, from like a real life betting perspective, do you think that makes the underdogs overvalued or undervalued? Because if there's a ton of parity, I think everyone starts to convince themselves like any underdog has a shot. So I start to think that the perceived ability of a team to win is going to be higher than it really is.
I'd agree with that, and I feel I think it. I find this happens in the NFL,
That's what I was thinking.
especially
Yeah,
because you have sort of a full week to build up these narratives,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
sort of everybody gets locked into
Take
their
lock.
priors.
Take lock.
Yeah, exactly. And I think watching the LEC broadcast over the weekend, I think that this parody narrative is something that they've really started to hammer home.
Yeah.
Talking about the rise of Rogue and sort of XL over the past couple of weekends. And so I think once I think that's sort of a leading indicator of where the public's mind will probably be. So I think that you're right. Like I think the value on the underdogs was before, if you could have seen this,
Yeah.
sort of more condensed league coming.
Yeah. Okay, so give me the rest of your rankings. So we have G2 first, Fnatic second, and then what?
Yeah. So Fnatic second, and then I would say sort of they're probably in their own tier.
Okay.
Behind them is Rogue in third and Mad Lions, very close together. Um, Fifth is Origin, sixth Misfits, and seventh XL. Those three are sort of grouped together. Eighth, I have SK. Ninth, Vitality, with those two grouped together, and then Schalke in 10th.
Okay, so I have G2 in the first tier by themselves, Fnatic in the second tier by themselves, Rogue and Mad by themselves. Is that correct?
You might be able to crunch them together with there's not much that separates them from the next three,
Yeah,
but for the sake of whatever. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So let's see what ESPN has to say about that real quick, and then I'll give my take on it because I think that we have seen some interesting things from these teams that I've kind of touched on in some different videos. But let's go from the bottom. So we have Schalke in last place, which is the same as yours. Then we have XL, which is interesting. I think XL is kind of interesting. They don't have proven players, so that kind of makes it more difficult to believe in them. But they have been playing pretty well, like in surprising spots too, where they're beating teams that they shouldn't necessarily even be competing with, let alone beating. But that's what kind of happens in these best of ones. What were you gonna say?
I've been sort of, or these numbers, and I think my resulting picks have been sort of one step behind or ahead. I don't know which one, but probably behind on XL. I was really high on them in the first couple weeks when they lost, and then was really low on them in the past couple weeks when they won. And now they're I think relatively high on them again.
Yeah, so
probably a bad sign.
So let me try to give more of like an opinion on this. So I agree that G2 is still probably the best team in Europe from a talent perspective. I expect them to do much better moving forward. I don't know when Perks is going to rejoin the team. I would assume it's this week, but I'm not sure about that. So I would say G2 is going to be moving up as the season progresses. I'd be shocked if they don't make a run at the title because they're just from a talent perspective, they're that much better than everyone. For DraftKings, however, I think that they're still going to be extremely highly priced because G2 is still thought of as that style of team. So whether or not their their money lines might actually move into a direction that makes their prices lower and makes people play them even more on DraftKings. That is kind of what I see happening in the short term. So when we get to the LEC slates this weekend, if they're a little bit lower in terms of pricing, their ownership is going to be out of control. Right? Isn't that kind of what you're expecting as well?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. They're usually one of the higher projected kills teams in the LEC from a Vegas perspective, which I think it matters, but to your point, I think to me at least matters a lot less in a one game series because you just have more variance and maybe you get a bloody game from somebody else and they're the better team for that slate.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd throw in there is that the numbers. The eGOAT numbers are driven on a player-by-player basis, and so I take sort of for most of these teams, right, they have a pretty solid or pretty known starting roster.
Yeah.
But for teams that switch it up a little bit, I use the most recent or the most common.
Sure.
And so the G2 numbers still have perks in there, as opposed to I actually don't know how to say the other guy's name. Pinoy?
Yeah, something like that. So, okay, so...
The one throws me off.
Yeah. P1 Noi. So this week G2 is playing against Mad Lions in Origin. I think against Mad Lions they might actually be an underdog, which is absolutely insane. I couldn't find a line yet. So I think from a DraftKings perspective, that's going to be the most highly owned game easily, like not even close. People want to play G2. People want to play Mad Lions. So we're going to see a ton of people on that. Schalke was the lowest rated team. Then it was XL, Vitality, Origin, Fnatic, SK, Misfits, G2, Rogue, and Mad. So the biggest differences that we're seeing are at the top of the table from Mad and Rogue. So I think the wins that they're receiving in real life is impacting public perception a ton because they're beating teams that were like true competition and true tests for them. So they've seemingly passed all of these tests and have done it in convincing fashion. So the fact that the eye test is putting them so much higher is something that I would try to exploit in the future. So Mad Lions playing against G2, I could see them losing that match. Mad Lions playing against XL this week, I think that they probably take care of XL. I do think Mad Lions is a good team. I just don't think that they're better than G2. If they played a best of 3 or a best of 5, I would expect G2 to take that. And if the sportsbook thought otherwise, I would try to play that. Fnatic's up against Vitality and Misfits. Those are two pretty difficult matches. I think that Fnatic does turn it around, but I'm not sure it's necessary to happen next week. Actually, they're not even playing this week. They're playing the following week. So we have a little bit of a break from the LEC. I forgot about that. So I would say yes to the two differences that you have. I agree with. I think G2 and Fnatic should be higher. So I'm glad that the statistics are supporting that, even if the rankings from the supposed professionals at ESPN are not. Next up, let's go to Korea or China. Do you have a preference?
We can do the LCK. You said that first.
All right, sure. So the LCK, what do you got?
All right. And so I was actually, when we started talking just starting to update these for last night's games, which is going to presumably have a pretty big impact here with respect to DRX. But
sure, yeah.
Before last night, the LCK rankings I had were T1 up top, bunched together with DRX in second and DWG in third. Sort of another tier down in fourth would be Gen G in the tier by themselves. Below that, in a third tier, would be KT and Team Dynamics. And probably Afrika too. I'd probably throw them in that same tier.
Sure.
In eighth, I have Sandbox, pretty close together with HLE in ninth, and then SP by themselves in the basement.
Okay, so ESPN. This was probably my main point of contention with ESPN's rankings. They're not believers in Korea or something. Like they just don't want to place them highly in their rankings for some reason. So we have SP at 46, which is supposedly the second worst team in all 4 regions, which just blows my mind. Then they have Sandbox followed by KT Rolster, who obviously after their victory is going to skyrocket up their rankings. Which is that's the reason why I have such an issue with their rankings, because now next week they're going to say, "Oh my God, KT beat DRX. They're so good. How did we miss that? Make them the 20th best team in the world." And it's just like, you should have been closer to that to begin with, because the competition, and in the LCK you have these talented players. It's not going to be like a complete cakewalk for these teams the entire season, and that's what we saw last year. Last split, the Gen G was the only team that really took care of business against all of the lower competition. DRX and T1 do struggle every once in a while in one of these matchups, so that's always something. I think
last night they sort of talked about it, like they sort of, I mean, I don't want to sort of take too much away from KT, but like the first draft or the first game, like it seemed like DRX was just sort of like, it was like a solo queue game, right? They're just like picking, there's no sort of cohesion to their champion pool, and they were just sort of going for these super aggressive plays, and it was like they were, just not sort of taking the game seriously almost.
Yeah.
And then, once you're down one game, they sort of couldn't dig themselves out of the hole in that third game.
Like it's like when you have somebody trying to turn it on, like at the end of a game, thinking, "Oh, this is going to be a joke." But then the other, like in the NBA, you see it a lot, where like an underdog jumps out to a big lead early in the game because the favorite just thinks like this is going to be the easiest game ever, and then they have a tough time kind of coming back into the game, even though basketball is a game of swings. League of Legends not so much.
And if I'm not mistaken, and so the other thing that I think plays into that you see the same narrative in sort of other sports is they have DWG on Saturday night. So you have a sort of mid-tier matchup midweek with this big game coming on the horizon.
Look ahead game.
Yeah, look ahead game, exactly.
Classic,
and you sort of get caught sleeping.
Sure. So with Solhewan Prince, we have them alone in the bottom tier. They were the last ranked team. Sandbox and Hanwha Life are in your fourth tier, which I think that makes sense. I've been pretty high on Hanwha Life for their talented bot lane, but I mean they've just been killing me. So I think that I'm not accurately lowering them in my opinion of them because of their top jungle and mid. But in a meta right now where jungle and mid seems to be so important, which isn't surprising, it's just that's just the way it is. Maybe I should have had them lower because of all the question marks surrounding their jungle and mid lane. They've looked like particularly bad in a lot of these games. So even if Viper and Lehens are playing well, this isn't the kind of meta that you can kind of just wait. So maybe I'm looking too much towards the end of the season, which is how I originally ranked all of my teams before the season started. So for a short-term thing, I would adjust them down. But long-term, I still think if the meta moves in that direction, Hanwha Life is going to be pretty good. Then we have...
and I just I think echo that. I these numbers liked Hanwha Life a lot coming into the summer split, and really up until last week when they just sort of got pounded by Afrika and DWG. They sort of sunk like a stone over those 4 games.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So my biggest thing with KT in their previous matchup against, I think it was Afrika Freaks, I said that I think if KT has a chance to be a playoff team, this is really a match where they need to show up and play really well, because it's early in the season, but when you're playing against a similarly talented team, or even a more talented team in Afrika Freaks, you need to be able to show you can actually compete with them to make it into that 6th spot for the playoffs, and they didn't really do that. But then they came up huge against DRX, which was very cool because they made another roster change, or 2 roster changes really. So Smeb was already playing. They pushed him down to support, and this is an amazing move by them, because one thing that we've seen recently is that a lot of support players have these gigantic champion pools because of picks that exist like Senna. So Senna allows the support to play kind of whatever they want, whatever fits into the team. So I'm sure that they were practicing that at some point, realized, well, Smeb already plays all of these champions. Why don't we just try out Smeb in support? So he replaced Tucson last night. He played 3 games of Maokai, I believe, and he was very good for a top laner transitioning to that role. Support is often thought of as the least important role in League of Legends. I think that's mistaken, but that's just the perception. So a team is more likely to try moving a top laner to support than vice versa. So they had Sowan in the top lane. They were still running Bono in the jungle, and then they played Yukal as their mid laner. And that was a pretty good move. And then Aiming also played much better last night than he has been previously. Aiming is thought of as a good mechanical player. And maybe if this Smeb thing works out, I think we see a team that can actually compete, maybe even sneak into the sneak into the quarterfinals of the gauntlet later in this season. Because that skill, the amount of skill it takes to transition from top to bottom, or from top to support from Smeb. Smeb has always been thought of as a smart player, a very risky playstyle kind of player, but if he can take his ability, like his mechanical ability, his knowledge of the game, his experience, his world's experience, and transition that to support, I think we're looking at a very interesting team. So I'm going to be pretty high on them, I think, as long as the roster stays the same.
I thought that during the cast last night, LS and Lyric were talking about that, and I thought brought up, and I guess they mentioned they talked about it before in a podcast, but I thought it was really interesting. LS said that he thought a direction that League will likely move at the professional level in the next couple of years is having these types of hybrid players where,
oh yeah, definitely,
and so you don't have a top laner and a mid laner. You have sort of a guy on your team who plays, Volibear and Aatrox and whoever. And if Aatrox is mid that game, then he's your mid laner. If Volibear's in the jungle, he's your jungler. And so it would give you just this edge that they had, because I think the announced lineup coming into last night for KT was that Smeb would still be up top and So On would be at support. And they sort of had this draft where, they were like, they didn't know, no one knew sort of where, or sort of who was going to play which champion, who was going to be where. And you sort of get that little, it's just another edge you can get on the opponent, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, so what I would compare that to in traditional sports, in international soccer or football, whatever you want to call it, you saw this transition towards positionless players where you have right wing backs that can go all the way up to play right wing, left wing back, left wing. So they have this mobility up and down the field because it allows for a play style that is more fluid. Then in Spain, you saw a lot of players that would play center back, but also center defensive mid or center mid, because they had the ball handling abilities, but were also great defenders. So you don't necessarily want to take that person off the pitch. You want to keep them on the field, just change them into a different position. And then because of like the kind of revolution that Spanish football had on the world, really, where it was much more important to have great passing ability, you had all of these players who were center midfielders, maybe weren't the best defenders, taking on that kind of hybrid role that eventually worked out very well. And now we're seeing it happen in basketball. So I was ahead of this in basketball as well. Like you have point guards that can play shooting guards that can play small forward. You have the 4s and 5s mixed up a lot of the time. I was talking to one of my friends about football. I think that football will eventually adopt this for slot receivers and pass receiving backs. And then also, I think you could do it with linemen. Those are the things that I think are the next evolution. Right now, you're already seeing it with linebackers and safeties, which is a brilliant change because you have these tight ends that can kind of play both roles as a wide receiver and a blocker very well. You're going to have gigantic mismatches if you don't have people that are the size of safeties or linebackers that can also have these cover abilities. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that's very smart. I've been talking about the move towards positionless League of Legends for years now, and that's one of the reasons. That's one of the things that I've been talking a lot about with our team. I coach Yale with Mick Scraggs, who was the head coach for Clutch Gaming back in the day. So we have had discussions about our solo laners trying to learn multiple roles because that is the direction it's moving in, and if it's not, then it should be. Because there's no reason to lock your players into one role. It kind of it stops their growth, really, in my opinion. I think everyone should be kind of playing multiple roles and understanding the game, because by understanding multiple roles, you understand the game better and you understand champions better. That's awesome. I didn't catch that part of the broadcast. I was asleep, but that's the kind of thing where I can talk about it now because LS has talked about it. If I talked about it and he hadn't talked about it, then I'm gonna get flamed. Right. Which is ridiculous. So
he's got to open that Overton window for you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he's just watching all of my videos from a few years ago and like he's just recycling my ideas. Who knows? I'm just kidding. That's not the case. He's been talking about this stuff for a long time as well. So I think like I said before, my big problem with ESPN is that they have the LCK teams ranked way too low relative to the LEC and the LCS. Even though, what were you gonna say?
It's almost like they were put in there. Like you said this initially, I think it's like as like a joke, but it almost feels like they were put in as an afterthought. You have like
Yeah.
5 teams grouped together in the bottom 40, and then 5 teams sort of grouped together in like between 10 and 20, and
Yeah.
but like every other league is sort of mixed together,
Yeah.
and then sort of like they threw the LCK in at the end.
Yeah, I wouldn't have an issue with that if that's the kind of approach that they had, where they're thinking to themselves, well, a mid-tier team in China is probably better than a mid-tier team in Korea, like doing that kind of thing.
Sure, right.
Fine, go ahead and do that, but don't put these random teams from North America or Europe above some of these teams from Korea, because if they played each other, they would get slapped. They like the sports book would not post the line that they're implying here, which is what is kind of very annoying to me. Because
Yeah.
when that happens, you're really hurting the people who are reading ESPN. Because if you see power rankings every single week come out where LCS, CLG, random 20 spot in the world ranking, whatever, and then they go to some kind of international event and play against a Korean team that they're ranked higher than in the power rankings, you're going to see the money line come out like the Korean team minus 200. Now you think to yourself, oh, I found a value spot. Just kidding. You were trusting the wrong people to give you information, and now you just lost $100. Good job.
Yeah. Like
So-
to your point, like KT was ranked behind Immortals going into last night, and then they beat
Yeah.
DRX. Like
Exactly,
like it's just
exactly.
something's off there.
Yeah, so let's go to the LPL. So I know it's a lot more teams. So let's just do the tier list first, and then I'll pick everything out from the ESPN rankings while you kind of give your thoughts on the rankings.
Sure. So I have top esports really alone up top.
Okay.
JDG sort of alone in its own tier, even in second, and then V5, Invictus, and FPX grouped together in a third tier.
Okay.
Fourth tier is I don't even know where there's a sort of a broad spectrum here, but I would really sort of put all these teams together. I guess I would go LGD, Suning, RNG, E-Star, and WE, who surprised they're that low. They were much higher recently, but so that would be the fourth tier. Fifth would then be OMG, BLG, who is surprisingly high.
Yeah.
EDG, Vici, and DMO, and then Rogue, Warriors, and LNG in the bottom tier.
Okay. So I think that's pretty interesting. I'm just going to make one adjustment. I'm going to put the V5, Invictus Gaming, and FPX up because we have like 5 tiers with everybody else, I think. So we have top esports alone in first. I don't think that I would rank them with a large gap between some of these other teams. I think JDG is probably still a little high based off of their previous success. So like a lot of their older stats, a lot of their older gold is going to kind of say these guys were the split champions last split, so don't sleep on them, right?
So the interesting thing to me, I expected them to start dropping here, but I was trying to pull up their schedule.
Yeah, they've been winning. They've been winning consistently still.
Yeah, and so that's sort of what I think really set in terms of these numbers. What set so these are the LPL numbers are 100% based on summer split right now. So there's no coming into the season there were spring and some MCS numbers in here.
Yeah.
But for TES and JGG, it's really their consistency. FPX and IG, less so recently, but maybe a couple at the beginning even here, would have those off games. And so if you lose and get clobbered by a bad team, the win differ, sort of margin of it's sort of like the old BCS numbers in college football, where margin of victory matters, and like if you're running up the score at the end of a game, you're going to get credit for that in these numbers. And similarly, if you just sort of say, well, we lost this one, so let's just keep diving into whoever, you're going to get punished for it, which is like, I think Rogue Warriors are a better team than these numbers show, but they have no problem just getting smashed if they know they're going to lose. And so they're going to get hurt in the numbers by that. And I think that, FPX will have those games where it's just like, what's going on here? Whereas JDG, like, they'll grind out those wins, and these numbers reward them for that.
Yeah. So we have, I think, a lot of points that are like different from ESPN here. I'm just trying to check if I have all of the teams listed. RNG, Sunning, LGD, Top Esports. Okay, so I was missing JDG. And JDG is 10th right now. I believe it's like this. So right now, ESPN Esports has Top Esports as the #1 team overall in the world. FPX is up there. Invictus Gaming is in their top 10. I think V5 is also in their top 10, and so is JDG. So they have 5 teams from the LPL in the top 10. Then they have World Elite, Sunning, RNG, EDG, LNG, which is very high compared to your tier list. LGD, which is a team I've been pretty high on since before the season started. OMG, Vici Gaming, BLG, DMO, eStar, and Rogue Warriors. So I think there are some interesting trends that are kind of at odds between what you're doing and what ESPN Esports is trying to accomplish. So LNG, you're basically, or actually before I get into that, you were talking earlier about the goal differentials between these teams and how the summer split stats were so important and why some of these have kind of stayed the same even when you anticipated it changing a little bit. What I would say is that JDG has won a lot of matches 2-0 even though they haven't looked amazing. So you're right, like, and that's why originally when we discussed this I kind of said something like the dominator rating, because they are dominant. They go out there, they take care of business, they're not giving up these random games to bad teams, and they're just constantly winning. So a team like Gen G performed well last split. That's kind of why they were so high to begin with. They've been moving down a little bit faster, but it makes total sense. I think that you're totally right with your take on why the numbers kind of came out this way. Top Esports being in a... Go ahead.
I was just saying, and I think that's why, I started including this sort of trailing sort of 10 or 15 games of the rating, because I think that looking at, for that reason, that looking at sort of the floor and ceiling of a team over its recent, sort of, this would, at a 10-game look back, you're looking at 25 games.
Yeah.
Sort of gives you, I think is also important, because you see a team like, FPX has, can be as high as, 2,000 in the past 10 games, but as low as, verging on, negative, below average. Whereas JDG, they never go below, 2,000, never go above 3,000. They're just sort of steady Eddie, which I think, coming back to what we were talking about up top, is sort of, then you have to come back to the eye test and say, is that a product of them? Is that a good thing? Does that say that they can win even when they're not at their best? Or is that showing vulnerability that, they can keep winning, sort of doing their thing, but if a really good team like Top Esports comes along, they're going to win because they can't get to that next level?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. So the one thing I would say, you also mentioned Rogue Warriors as a team that you were surprised is so low because of like a playstyle thing, and I think that is also correct, because one thing that I talk about a lot is what is the playstyle of the loser when they're losing, and is it in line with my view of League of Legends and how you should be approaching the game. I think that when you are losing, you should be trying to make plays to win the game, not to not look bad. You shouldn't be trying to save face. You should be trying to go all in as often as you can, because that's how you're going to eventually turn a game around. You see that a lot in solo queue, the pickup basketball style of game for League of Legends. And I think players forget that on the competitive stage because they don't believe the other team is going to make as many mistakes. But if you force them to make decisions over and over again, they are much more likely to make a gigantic mistake and throw the game back into question. So let's say a few words about some of these teams. So Top Esports, obviously, they've been very dominant. FPX have been fairly dominant. They had one really bad loss, but they're still a very good team overall. I think that I would probably put them a little higher than where they're at in your rankings for my own personal rankings. I'd
agree with that. To me, their ceiling is as high as anybody's.
Yeah.
I don't think they've got anywhere near it in the summer yet, but I think if they can string together 6 games where they're right up there.
Yeah. So Invictus Gaming in the ESPN rankings, I think them being third in the LPL right now is based off of like their pedigree as world champions in the past, and also they've been playing really well. I think the swap over to Ning is going to be very good for them long term. He won a world championship with them. They wanted to move into a different direction. Leon came in. He didn't perform well. He's not even performing well on Vici Gaming. He was benched. So he's going off and on for Vici Gaming. I think he's getting the start again tonight. But with Invictus Gaming, you still have that eye test where they're more in the vein of Rogue Warriors, where even if they're losing the game, they're going to contest. And I love to see that. Those are my favorite kinds of teams. I hate teams that just sit there and do nothing. And we talk about that with our players a lot for Yale as well, where it's like, I sent this actual message to McScragg last night. I said, I don't mind losing when we are actually doing stuff. Because there's nothing worse than watching like a slow train wreck where you know it's all going wrong and your team's not even trying to contest anything. There's nothing more difficult to watch as a coach than just giving up. Invictus Gaming, I love that.
You can tell how by how terrible my sleep patterns are by how much I'm quoting the LCK and LPL broadcast here. Yeah. But during the I guess like Monday night into Tuesday morning games on Rogue Warriors when they were playing Vichy, and I think it was the first game when they were getting drubbed pretty early on. Lyric made the same point that you did. He's like, look, like, and the other thing he added in is on a professional level, there's also the embarrassment factor, right? Like if thousands of people are watching, you don't necessarily want to go up there and put up like a 7 or 8 kill game where you have 7 or 8 deaths. Yeah. But Rogue Warriors just like, they got down early and they just kept trying to invade the other team's jungle, right? And they lost half of those fights, but he's like, if you can get, pick somebody off, get a couple kills, go steal a Baron, you can actually get back in the game as opposed to just slow bleeding out.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, it's so funny, I think we talked about this in our last video as well, for a game that is so focused on numbers and statistics and stuff like that, the numbers and statistics that we have available to us suck, and we should be looking to like the real life stuff, whereas it's the opposite for traditional sports where we have all this visual information. We need those statistics to kind of balance us out. So in League of Legends, one thing that is actually a number that people should think about more often is when you create a proactive play and go for a pick in the enemy jungle or something like that, when an objective is coming up, you are eliminating gold from the map. You are eliminating like between a fifth to a third of the enemy team's gold on the map. If a team has earned 50,000 gold in a game and you pick off the support and let's say they have 8,000 to 9,000 gold at like the 30-minute mark, you're removing 8,000 to 9,000 gold from the rift. That instantly makes it more likely for you to be able to fight the other team 4v5 or whatever. Like, I think the reason why that isn't talked about more is because obviously 4 versus 5 you have a man advantage, but the man advantage can only be felt if the gold doesn't outweigh that, in my opinion. So let's just get back into some of these teams. So V5, I think V5, they've done everything they can to pass the eye test. I think that people are still apprehensive because of how bad they were last split. It is a completely different roster. I understand that. I still don't think they're as good as these top teams. They haven't played a lot of these top teams. A lot of people joke around with me saying, like, how do you continuously pick against the big dick bot lane? And I say, fair point. They're pretty intimidating. But I just, there's something about it where I can't trust them until they actually do it. So I will continue to pick against them, especially if I perceive value on the other side. For JDG, I think that I've been calling for regression for months now. And we have seen some of that regression when they're playing against good teams, because they were winning every coin flip against good teams, which is just unreal. So now they aren't doing that against the good teams, but they're still taking care of business against the bottom teams. So I think that the regression that I've been calling for has kind of already occurred. So when they get into these matchups against the top teams again, it's going to suck for me, but I think they're actually back into like coin flip range where it's going to be 55-45, 60-40 against some of these top teams, and I'm not sure that the sportsbook is going to reflect that accurately. When we get into the third tier, World Elite, I like World Elite a lot. I like Sunning a lot. I like RNG when they play Xiaohu. When you play these other players, I kind of lose interest. Gala played well instead of Betty the other day, which isn't something I was anticipating, but it ended up working out for them.
I expected them to be able to hold more water with Cryan in the mid lane. But yeah, just because I thought he performed really well in the spring. At least, he was on some good DFS teams. I guess is probably a better way to put it. But
yeah, exactly, and that does stick around. Like those memories of good wins they do stick around. I would say from a form or a class perspective, like I know in international football, class is talked about often. Like form is temporary, class is permanent. I think of Xiaohu as a class player where he is world class. I think of Cryan so far as someone who has proven to have form, but we haven't seen him do it over a long period of time. So
And he's a younger player, is that right?
I think a little bit younger. I think
Yeah.
Xiaohu's probably surprisingly young though. So E-Star, I'm surprised E-Star is up there. I think that they probably don't belong in there. Maybe they've had a weaker schedule. That's something I would look at. OMG, BLG being so OMG, I think that they've been pretty good. They're the opposite of Rogue Warriors. When they are losing, they're not going to try to contest every objective. So that's why I prefer Rogue Warriors against a team like OMG. BLG just got their jungler back, so Meteor is having a tremendous impact on the rest of the team. In their match against Invictus Gaming today, he played really well in the first game. They ended up winning the first game. Then they lost the next 2 games. But even in those losses, Meteor had a good performance. EDG is a team that I'm very high on and will continue to be very high on because of their talent and experience and youth. It's like a strange combination for a team that is kind of losing some matches. But I think long-term EDG is the kind of team that can make a huge run in the second half of the split. Vici Gaming, they made a change recently with their mid laner, Zika. That's been a great change for the team. It's going to make them very competitive against the bad teams and the middle-tier teams, probably not against the upper echelon like what we see tonight when they play FPX. So I still expect them to lose.
My numbers love Zika. He always pops off in my model.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then Dominus, they've been making some changes and stuff recently. I'm not a huge Dominus fan. Just way too much uncertainty around their roster. Rogue Warriors, again, a team I like a decent amount. LNG, a team that I like probably more than being... Like, this is where the relative strength on the world stage comes into play, because I think Rogue Warriors or LNG, if you throw them in the North American LCS or the LEC, they do not come in 10th place. That's kind of my view on it.
Oh yeah, I like. I mean, I don't have a good sense, but like my expectation, sort of, I guess, was probably a combination of like 1/3 eye test and 2/3 listening to people like you and others who know a lot more about this stuff than me. Is like I would expect them to be like the second place team. Like I would put Rogue Warriors on like the level of like a FlyQuest or TSM. Like that seems like a probably even matchup or 55-45 type thing.
Yeah, maybe 60-40, because you have to do kind of give credit to teams that win, but yeah, I think it's going to be much closer than what the sportsbook would list it at. So that's basically it. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss specifically about your rankings or stats or like stuff looking forward?
No, yeah, I think the one thing that we've touched on a little bit here and we talked about on Twitter is I'm trying to put together a cross league sort of adjustment here so that I can compare these numbers on a league by league basis.
Sure.
And so I guess to wrap it up, that where I had everything coming into last night, which again will change in terms of like a top 10, would be T1 first, then DRX, then Top Esports, then Damwon, then C9, then Gen G, then JDG, then V5, which, you know, I think the same qualifiers apply there. Invictus Gaming 9th, and G2 in 10th, with honorable mention to FPX in 11th.
Okay, so yeah, give me that top 11 again.
Yeah, so first is T1.
Yep.
Second is DRX.
Okay.
Third is Top Esports. Fourth, DWG. Fifth, C9. Sixth, Gen G. Seventh, JDG. Eighth, V5. Ninth, IG. 10th, G2. 11th, FPX.
Okay, that's very cool. I think that I would probably still put Top Esports above T1 and DRX at this point. I am very high on T1 in general. That's probably some of my bias being in there. I think I would drop C9 a little bit in terms of how I would expect them to perform against a lot of these teams. So I don't know if you're familiar with Chris Harris, the guy that does a lot of fantasy football stuff. He has like the Harris Football Podcast. He used to be for ESPN. One way that he typically ranks players is by saying, like, if I had to pick between these two players, who would I pick? And then he just does it with like every single player. Like, the guy's a machine. So if I was doing that with like the top 11 here, if I put C9 against FPX, I'd probably take FPX. If I took C9 against G2, I'd probably take G2. C9 against Invictus Gaming, That's a little bit more of a question mark because of the volatility of Invictus Gaming, but I would probably still end up on the Invictus Gaming side. V5 against C9, there it's pretty close, closer than Invictus Gaming. JDG against C9, that's somewhat close as well, but I think I'd end up on JDG. Gen G against C9, I kind of think C9, just from a stylistic perspective, I think they'd be able to give Gen G a lot of problems. So that's a surprising one for me, but I would put them above Gen G. Against Damwon Gaming, I think Damwon Gaming does a better job of what C9 does in those kinds of games, but I wouldn't be shocked if C9 made it very competitive with them. C9 against Top Esports, I would expect Top Esports to beat them pretty easily. DRX against C9. DRX always has a lot of question marks around their draft, so if they try something cute and like drop a game stupidly, then I could see C9 actually beating them in a series just because of like organizational problems that they potentially have. But from a talent perspective, I think DRX is certainly better than C9. And then T1 against C9, I would take T1 every game. Because they're a no-nonsense organization. Like, mid-season cup, you saw that they were trying some new things out, which was kind of not normal for T1. When we get to Worlds and T1 is sitting there across the table from C9, there's no way you're picking C9. Maybe they come out on top, but very unlikely in my opinion. So that's all we got today. Billy, thanks for stopping by. Another great conversation. Obviously, you're invited back whenever you want to do this, a weekly thing, whatever you want to do. I love this long form stuff. A lot of the people that watch this really enjoy this as well because we get into a lot of like specific stuff that you can't really cover in like a quick hitter 5-10 minute video. So thanks again. Before we get out of here, is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, man. Thanks for having me. Glad to do it. And yeah, let's do it again.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. And I'll talk to you later.